Bridgett Flood. I think most of you should have her bio in front of you. But what I will say about her personally is Miss Bridgett Flood is one of our more compassionate citizens in our community about making sure that there's equity and opportunities for all members of our society. Her foundation works very hard in supporting families and young people in North St. Louis and in communities that are struggling to survive. She does a lot to empower organizations, to empower our families. And so I appreciate her in her work. She has been very receptive, open, and amenable in many ways to the opportunities and to the things that need to get done, and is willing to roll up her sleeve and get it done. And that's what I like about her. And so I'm honored, I'm absolutely honored to be able to bring her to Washington Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church so that you will have a chance to meet one of the people in our community who is doing such great work to make sure that our children and our families have the opportunity to truly be what God has called them to be. And so I'm going to ask her to come. She's going to come, and first I'm going to ask her to tell us a little bit about the Incarnate Word Foundation, who they are, their mission, and the kind of projects that the Incarnate Word Foundation does in our community. One of the things, she won't mention this, I know she won't, but many of you may know that we have a micro-lending ministry here at Washington Tabernacle that was really born out of a need to support our families who may find themselves in a position where they have to visit one of the predatory loan institutions for just a couple of $100s to make it from week to week. And Bridgett Flood and the Incarnate Word Foundation extended to us a grant, a $5,000 grant, and we matched it with $2,500 to put $7,500 in there. And we started and we launched this micro-lending ministry at our church that many members in our congregation have already benefited from and found the need to just get just a couple of $100s. I'm telling you, a flat tire can wreck your budget when your budget is tight. Amen, somebody. You know, just a little something that wasn't in the budget. Just come and wipe the whole thing out, and you need to continue moving. And so it has meant a lot to many of our families, and we're very appreciative of the support of the Incarnate Word Foundation. This is the kind of stuff that they do to really, truly help families in need from day to day. And so I want to welcome to Washington Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church, Ms. Bridgett Flood and the Incarnate Word Foundation. Why don't you guys put your hands together with me and welcome them.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Francis. And it's an honor to be back here with all of you today. Just a little bit about the Incarnate Word Foundation. The Incarnate Word Foundation is a ministry of the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word. I am not a sister, but I work for sisters. And one of our board members, Ron Jackson, is here sitting right in front, so I can't ignore his questions. But our sisters historically worked in North St. Louis. They sponsor Incarnate Word Academy in Normandy, which is a wonderful school. Sister Helena Monahan is the principal there. And our sisters, many of them grew up in North St. Louis in places like Penrose O'Fallon, Hamilton Heights, the Old Blessed Sacrament Catholic School was one of their schools. The old St. Engelbert's, which is now St. Louis Catholic Academy, was one of their schools. So our sisters have historic ties to the community and are very interested in the work here in St. Louis. I know today I was supposed to talk about social services in Ferguson, but what I'd like to talk about is really what are the fundamental issues that have brought us to where we are today, and how is the foundation or charitable sector responding? And I think we can all agree that what's brought us here today is something that isn't new. It's something that's been going on for hundreds of years, and it's the systemic racism that we have in our society that has led us to where we are today. And I think things things like the killing of Michael Brown, all the deaths we've seen in our community recently, is probably just the straw that's broken the camel's back. And so finally, people are having a more honest conversation about this. At the foundation, as we reflected on what to do in response to all the events in Ferguson and the aftermath of that, many of my colleagues, we had a meeting, so all the foundation and funding people got together. There were about 50 of us. And it was interesting to me because some people really felt, well, there were some people who were like, we don't know what to do, so they were kind of over here. But then you had people who were saying, we need to respond immediately. And so what they did is they funded things like social services, food drives, personal care items, then they moved into the area of counseling, that sort of thing. And then you had a couple foundations, and we would be in this area, that said we want to look at the systemic underlying causes of this, and how do we change what's going on so that things get better in a broad way, which takes, I think, a longer view as opposed to the short term. So I'm really here to talk about the longer view. And as we think about the longer view isn't just about what happened in Ferguson. It isn't just about what happened in Fountain Park recently. It isn't just about all those instances, because those are manifestations of this bigger picture. And so we looked at things like, and I'm sure you're familiar with some of this, either in your own lives or what you have read. I think about the For Sake of All report that Jason Purnell published, Dr. Purnell, where he talks about how the life expectancy of where we're sitting right now is 18 years less than if we were out in Clayton. When you think about the lack of access to quality education, I think about a minister in East St. Louis, Reverend Chet Cantrell, who I was with recently, who was talking about how at his agency, most of the kids who graduate from East St. Louis High School, who are the top students, have been at his agency. He's helped them. It's a youth program. And most of these young people have to go to 2 years of remedial classes when they go to college. Well, the problem with that is then you need your Pell Grants, and you run out of Pell Grants before you can finish. So I think about the educational inequity. Then you think about things like the disparate impact of violence in our community, where certain populations, like where we're sitting right here, have much higher instances of violence in their lives than people who are living in Chesterfield. What does that do to people? We're learning that it affects people's physiology, so that people have higher stress rates. We're learning that it affects things like blood pressure, diabetes, all those things that result in shorter lifespan that Jason Purnell talks about. Then we think about what does the broader world see? And you think about how people are portrayed in the media. I mean, it's to the point where my husband and I don't really watch the news anymore, because everything you see is about violence in the African American community, violence perpetrated by African Americans. It's not just the news, it's the television program. It's just violence, violence, violence. But it's also stigmatizing a certain group of people in our community, African Americans. So when you start adding all that together, and then you come to what I think the ultimate determinant of a lot of this is, which is the inequity of wealth in our community. I don't know how many of you heard about the recent study that said for African Americans, even those with college degrees lag behind the white population in terms of their income. And I think of a study that I read recently by the Pew Foundation that shows that the median household wealth of a white family is $149,100. Now that takes into account their home, maybe they have some investments, that sort of thing. And these are recent statistics. The Asian American community, the median wealth for Asian Americans is about $109,000. And what that median means is it's not an average. It means half the people are above and half the people are below. Hispanic families are at around $13,000. So we see this huge discrepancy. African Americans, $10,700. Now when you're dealing with that big of a wealth inequity, what does that mean? That means, you use the example of the flat tire with Francis. That means that in an African American family, somebody gets a flat tire and the family isn't able to pay for the flat tire. In a white family, what that means is they pick up the phone and they say, Mom, I've got a flat tire. I don't have any money. Can you pay for this? There's a whole phenomenon with student loans where white families, because of this higher net worth, are able to pay for their children's student loans. That means that their children are able to buy a home quicker, begin accruing their own wealth. When their parents die, they inherit that wealth. So you can see that this wealth inequity is a huge factor. And to me, it's the biggest factor. Because when you don't have access to money for all those little inconveniences in life, one little thing can set you back. And the other thing that happens is that in the white community, even for, and this is my own personal theory here, so I could be wrong, but if you have a if you have a whole family, like I have 21 cousins. I have some cousins who live in West County, my fancy cousins. I have some cousins who live in rural Missouri in the woods. We don't want to go there. And I've got everybody in between. So if there's a problem in our family, there's this net worth over here with the wealthier relatives that can help the low-income relatives. But if your community's net average or median net worth is $10,700 versus $149,000, you can't provide the same kind of assistance. And so one problem suddenly can create lots of problems. And so as I think about this has really kind of been the undercurrent to how we've done things at the foundation in response to Ferguson. We've been looking at these fundamental inequities. And we've looked at them in three ways. One thing that we started funding, we didn't start this project, we just kind of joined in, was the mother-to-mother dialogues. And I know that Reverend Francis's wife, Leah, has been instrumental in those. I attended one of those sessions, and to hear, this was another example of disparity, to hear the pain in the room, and to see the difference in experience that white mothers have with white children, and African American mothers have with African American children, is heartbreaking. And shortly after I went to the mother-to-mother dialogue and saw how just the huge difference in how we view our children and what we teach our children, what our children experience. A friend of mine's daughter was killed in a drive-by shooting, African-American friend of mine, and my daughter and I both have known Cynthia for many years, and we went to the funeral. And as we were walking out of the funeral, I looked at my daughter, who's about 28 years old, and I said, you know, Amelia, I've worried about many things where you're concerned. I've worried about drunken driving. I've worried about, running into bad men in college. I've worried about lots of drugs, lots of things. But I never worried that you would be shot on the front porch walking into somebody's home. This never occurred to me. This is a totally different reality. And I think about the aftermath of that, and my friend's daughter, they haven't solved the murder, was 3 lines in the newspaper. If this had been my daughter, this would have been huge news. Huge news. I think about the young woman from SLU, the white woman who was killed in the Central West End. People still talk about this. Huge news. Nobody's talking about Cynthia's daughter. Nobody. When they talked about it in the paper, 3 lines, and that was it. And my friend lives with that every day. So huge discrepancy here. And that's why we fund the mother-to-mother dialogues that Dr. Christy Griffin is having. I think that's very important because it teaches people, especially white people, that there's a huge discrepancy here. And until we start addressing that, we're never going to fix what happened with Ferguson because we don't value life the same way. And that's the fundamental piece of it, I think. The other thing we're doing is STL Youth Jobs. And STL Youth Jobs is an employment program that grew out of the St. Louis Youth Violence Prevention Task Force. Reverend Francis was part of that. And this past summer, we had about 400 young people in the city of St. Louis. We had a jobs program in Ferguson. That was more of a full-time program for 6 months, which has just been renewed, that helped 100 young people. And then we had some other monies that have come through the state. So we had about 200 young people through the state this summer. And what I've learned from STL Youth Jobs is that young people want to work, but the opportunity for them to work is extremely limited. In Ferguson, I can give you some examples specifically from that program. I think of one young woman who has a little boy. She had been working at DePaul Hospital. Her little boy's dad was very actively involved in the family, died of sickle cell anemia, leaving her alone. She was living with her parents. Both of her parents were shot. Didn't die, but both shot. And then her car broke down. Now let's go back to this wealth discrepancy. So we've got median income, or median net worth, 10,700 over here. So what does she do? She doesn't have family members who can help her financially. She doesn't have any money to fix the flat tire, but fortunately, through STL Youth Jobs, one of the other employers is auto repair tire place. They fix the tire at cost, just for the cost of the tire. People at Mercer will donate that money. She was able to keep working, and she was hired full-time at DePaul Hospital. So she has a full-time job with benefits, paying a living wage so she can help her family. But see, this is the other piece of it. She's using her money to help her parents, to help her siblings. If you're in this $149,000 category over here, those young people aren't having to use their money to help their parents, help their family, because their family has a lot of money already, right? So once again, we've got that disparity. So even though people are getting jobs, catching up is almost impossible. The third thing we're doing, and this is the project I would say that's occupying most of our time right now, is the Shut It Down project. And it's called Shut It Down, Racial Equity in the Juvenile Justice System. We've been working with Judge Mason and Judge Jimmy Edwards to look at the disproportionate share of African American youth who are referred to the juvenile justice system. And what we're finding is that on any given day in juvenile detention, there are probably about 25 young people, and maybe one is white. All the rest are African American. Now, why is that? So we started digging, and what we've learned is, the young people already have talked a bit about this at the church a couple weeks ago, is it has to do with the St. Louis City Public Schools and how young people are being disciplined in the schools. It has to do with suspension rates. And what we're also learning is that the suspensions are actually higher than what is being reported in the news. In the news, they say we're leading the nation in school suspensions of African American children. But in reality, the numbers are worse because, and I can understand why they would do this. You know, there are young people who come in, there's a discipline problem, and what they'll say is, not you're suspended. They'll say, you can't come back to school, I'm sending you home, you can't come back to school until your mother comes, or your dad comes, or somebody comes. Well, the effect of that is the same as a suspension, you know, so they're not attending school. It doesn't go on their record. Now, some people will say, well, that's because they want to deflate the statistics and not show how many people are being let out. I don't know that that's necessarily the truth. I think that for some, they don't want a suspension on that child's school record. So it's kind of good, bad in terms of the rationale behind this. So what are we going to do about this? Well, I think the thing we don't do is say the people in the public schools are bad. because that's not true. I have yet to meet a teacher in one of the public schools. My husband was a teacher for about 25 years. I've yet to meet a teacher who goes to school every day thinking, I don't want children to learn, I want to be mean to these children, I want to kick them out of my classroom. That is not true. These are dedicated educators who are working hard, but they don't have the tools because, once again, the inequity comes into play. So, for example, the St. Louis City Public Schools have about 40 social workers. I think they have, 108 schools. So we have a lot of schools without a social worker. The teachers do not have adequate support. The teachers are trying to teach and trying to manage children who are coming from impoverished situations. How do you teach a child who just saw somebody get shot in the streets the night before? How does that child come to school ready to learn? I have a little friend, she went to the KIPP school, she's African American, went to the KIPP school for a year and a half, was doing great, went from pre-reading, 5th grade, to reading at 3rd grade level in 1.5 years. Her dad gets released from prison. She had never met her dad and spends the weekend with her dad and his family, comes to school on Monday, totally loses it, gets in a fight, ends up getting kicked out of school. Now, how is that the teacher's fault? How is that even the child's fault? We're talking about a fundamentally inequitable situation here. And the schools are not properly equipped because they don't have the money in order to deal with these situations. So looking at this, what do we do? We've created equity teams in 8 pilot schools where we are working with the teachers so that the teachers can come up with solutions in terms of discipline policies and how those policies will be enforced. We're not coming in saying the teachers are bad. We're saying to the teachers, what do you think would work? How do we work with you to better this situation? And I have great hope for this. The project is under the direction of Dr. Norman White, who's a criminologist at St. Louis University, also a former public school teacher. We're working closely with Dr. Adams and Stacy Clay at the district so that we can work with them, not point a finger. The newspaper was great in that article, pointing a finger, but they don't talk about any of this backstory. So we're working with them to try and improve the situation for our young people. Because I know one of the articles I've read about this talked about, well, what's the big deal if somebody is suspended for a couple days? Or what's the big deal if somebody is in the juvenile justice system just overnight? Well, it's a huge deal. I don't know anybody in this room who wants their child to be suspended from school. I don't know anybody who wants their child to even have any interaction at all with the juvenile justice system. And it's an inequitable situation because in the case of white students, they are treated differently. They are disciplined differently. I have a friend who's white, who has an African American son that he adopted. He went to school because his son had been disciplined and they were talking about suspending his son. He said as soon as he walked in that door, oh no, we weren't going to suspend him. No, we've got an alternative here. And what was interesting to me is when we started the project, there were about 15 of us in a room. I'd say about half the people were white, half were black. And none of the white people in the room had ever been suspended from school. Every African-American person in that room, and these were people who were PhDs, all professional people, had either been suspended themselves or had close relatives who had been suspended. It was fascinating, and I thought about my brothers. My brothers were in trouble all the time, went to Catholic school, we all went to Catholic school, always in trouble for nuns. My brothers were never suspended. Actually, I can't think of any of my 21 cousins or siblings who were suspended from school. Now, why is that? It's called a fundamental inequity in our society. And until we address inequities like that, I don't see how we're going to solve, the Ferguson issue, because we're not addressing what's at the heart of the matter. And even with, I know there's a Department of Justice report, I know that Reverend Starsky Wilson has worked very hard with the Ferguson Commission. The bottom line is, it hasn't fundamentally changed how things are being done in St. Louis. I think of friends of mine, African-American friends of mine, who have been stopped, even after Ferguson, repeatedly by the police. I think of a man, 67 years old, who lives in Manchester, Missouri. He's driving out there by Chesterfield. He gets pulled over by the police. This was about 2 months ago. He said, what did I do? What's the problem? And the police officer says, what are you doing out here? Well, I live out here. He hands him his driver's license, and he said, oh, well, you can go. And then he said, well, why did you pull me over? Which is a pretty bold thing to even ask, but he did. Well, you were driving too close to the center lines. Now, when I go to San Antonio, I drive around with our sisters, most of whom are a little advanced in years, shall we say. Driving with them is an experience. I mean, I think about the center line, and I think about just the line over here, and I'm stepping on the imaginary brake all the time. I've never seen one of our sisters get stopped for driving too close to this line, too close to that line, maybe not quite stopping at the stop sign. And this gentleman was stopped for driving too close to the white line. I was just with a woman the other day, African-American woman, who said, she had very short hair, kind of a big person. She drives a BMW. I was visiting with her at St. John's United Church of Christ. And she said in Jennings, she was pulled over a couple weeks ago. The officer came up to her, it was at night, looks at her and says, oh, it's you. You can go. And she said, it's me? And he said, yes, you can go. She said, do I know you? Well, no, but you can go. And then she said, well, why did you stop me? Well, I thought your plates might be expired. There's really no might about your license plates being expired. They're either expired or they aren't. There's nothing in between here. And you can see that without pulling somebody over. But her theory is, because this happens to her a lot, is that her silhouette looks like a man because her hair is very short. She's kind of a big person. And so she thinks they're stopping her because of the car she's driving, and she looks like she's a man. So she's immediately suspect. Now, given that we've had all this Department of Justice activity, all this media attention, obviously things we haven't moved the needle on this. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I believe, and I don't know how we would bring this about, but I believe the fundamental issue for us is this income inequality. Because until we address this huge disparity in wealth between the white community, the African American community, the Hispanic community, and the Asian community is kind of up here with the white community, until we address that, we're never going to be able to get at the heart of these other issues. Because there was just an article the other day that African Americans who go to college don't make as much as their white counterparts. So they're not, even when you go to college, you're not going to close the gap. And then you've got all this inherited wealth that keeps getting recycled in the white community. How do we deal with that discrepancy? And that discrepancy, I believe, is what causes all these other things. It causes inequity in education, inequity in opportunity, inequity in employment. It accounts for the disparate share of people in juvenile detention, and it also labels people as, if you look at the media, they are always vilifying the African American community. Until we address those things, all this other work is not going to have the systemic impact we need to have in order to change our society to one that truly is equitable, because it isn't right now. And I don't mean to end on such a dismal note, because, as I was saying before to someone, good habits despite our best efforts, and the Holy Spirit is always with us. Otherwise, I can't even imagine what the world would be like. But we have a lot of work to do. And the path that leads me to, and I don't begin to know how to do this, I was talking around about this before I came up here, is the need for some sort of reparations, some sort of way of redistributing this huge wealth gap, because I've thought about this a lot this past week thinking about coming here. I don't know how you ever narrow that gap. And no matter what you do, I mean, if you've got this net worth up here and net worth down here, how do you, I mean, it would take centuries, I think. I'm not an economist, so I don't know. I was an English major. I'm better with words. But it would take a long time. How do we change that? Because right now, we're just running through the same cycle all the time. So, all I can say is thank you for having me here. I wish I had the answer. I don't. But that's a little bit about what we're doing at the Incarnate Word Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think now you can see why I really want her to come to share with us, because we talked a lot about, the previous folks have talked a lot about what the policies and practices and laws and regulations and rules and stuff like that. But Bridgett always cut to the chase. She always had the courage to name what needs to be named and call out what needs to be called out in rooms with other folk are a little hesitant to do so. Because we do believe that at the core of a lot of what's happening in our community is that economic inequities. It is there. And lack of jobs, lack of opportunity, meaningful enjoyment, and this wealth thing. That's huge. Medium wealth in the African American community, $10,000. Which is below the federal poverty line, by the way. Medium wealth in white Asian, $100,000. That's huge. That's huge, and that has huge implications upon a community's infrastructure and their ability to move their children and children's children along very successful lines. And now I know many of us want to say, well, you know, I grew up poor. No, I didn't grow up poor. I grew up poor. We couldn't even afford the R in the word poor. So we were just poor, P-O, right? But we didn't have a whole lot. But we weren't out shooting people. We weren't out doing violence. We weren't out doing drugs. We weren't out, et cetera. We're quick to move to that, right? We're quick to move to that without really considering that society today, poverty today, is very different than when poverty was back in 1940 and 50. And then what I mean by that is the community of support that you had. Because even though you didn't have a whole lot of money, you did have big mama, grandmama, or a neighbor next door that when you needed some cup of sugar, you could go next door and get it. Or you needed somebody to watch the child while you went out to work, you had it. Or if you needed a flat tire, there was somebody around the corner who had one to give it to you. We were much more of a community that shared resources then than we see now in our community. And even African Americans of means, we're so spread out across this region. If you can find 2 or 3 African American families in means in one community, you're doing good. Because most of us are so spread out that we can't even support each other if we need the support. So this wealth gap thing is huge, and it carries huge implications. And I want to say this, and then we're going to entertain some questions from Bridgett. There was a Pew report out recently done by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and there was another organization, but it was a Pew report that stated, if I get this correct, that for the first time in history, there are more African Americans in poverty, right, than white Americans. Now, let me see if I can break that down. There's always been statistically more African Americans in poverty than white Americans when you consider the ratio. You know, we only make up 13 to 15% of the population, and yet there's a higher percentage of that, of African Americans in poverty related to that 15%. But there's always been more white people in poverty because it's more white people in America, right? But now, this recent report has shown that even though there are more white people in America than black people still make up a larger share of the poverty than all of white people. So what that means is, for whites, the wealth gap, the poverty gap has closed, and for African Americans, it's gotten even larger. That's huge implications. And one of the things that Jason Parnell's report, For the Sake of All, and Jason is always saying this, if you listen to him, he will always say this. One of the things that report has revealed to us is that context, right? Context matters in terms of the choices and decisions you make. Now, what am I saying? Don't ever say what you won't do until you're in that position. So don't ever say that you won't, carry a package for somebody across the street, and they're going to give you $100 to do it. Don't ever say you won't let somebody have something in your house that you know is not legal. You don't have any money, you need money, can't get money, they're going to drop $1,000 on you. Just keep this in my house, we'll come and get it when we need it. Don't ever say what you won't do until you're in that position. Context does matter, and it does influence decisions. It does influence choices. And a lot of people are making very tough, hard choices that are not good choices simply because of the poverty situation that they find themselves in. And we need to understand that and understand how this wealth gap plays into much of what we see happening. Much of what we see happening. And in terms of our public schools, when there's nobody there paying taxes, no property owners paying property taxes, then there's no money coming into the district to have the kind of things that we need. And so I appreciate Bridgett bringing that conversation to us, elevating it to us, helping us to connect the dots between the wealth gap and what's happening in our community so we can better be informed and educated about what solutions are needed. What solutions are needed to make this happen. So I'm going to open up the floor for questions for Bridgett, to anyone who may have them. Any questions? Yes, ma'am. Come forward if you can.
May I just talk loud?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, she kind of ended it on the truth, but you said you don't see how it will ever change. Why would you say that?
Well, I think the challenge is when you think about our political climate today, how do we change this? When I was talking to Ron beforehand, Ron said, before you do this, it would have to be a lot of education. Because for one thing, as he said, the 1% who have everything would figure out a way to get this money too, and he's probably right about that. But I think given the political climate, I think about Donald Trump. I said that to Ron. What would Donald Trump say if a reporter said, let's talk about reparations? I mean, he'd probably just yell at him and kick him out of the room. So how do we approach this in a thoughtful way? And I think that's going to be a big challenge given our political reality in the United States, because if you look at all the pushback on affirmative action, and affirmative action is nothing compared to this. And, systematically they're continuing to try and dismantle affirmative action. They keep taking cases to the Supreme Court. And I think about the conversation at Mother to Mother, where the white moms were saying, well, we've taught our children to see everybody's the same. We raised our kids to say everybody's the same. Everybody's opportunity, we're all the same. There's no difference in anybody. And in some ways it's true. There's no difference in the fundamental dignity of every human being. However, the way people are treated is extremely different. And so minimizing this idea, they're doing it out of the sense of, well, we want everybody to be treated the same. But the bottom line is our society doesn't treat everybody the same. same. So when you say that, and you teach people that, and a lot of white people have been taught that, what that does is it has people saying, well, why do we need reparations? Why would we need affirmative action when we're treating everybody the same, except we aren't? So I think there's some really big obstacles, especially given, I mean, the negativity in the Republican Party to any kind of minority person of any description is going to make it very hard because it pulls the Democrats more to the center as opposed to more to the left where they're going to say, we're going to deal with this head on. That's why I say that, but I truly believe that is the only way to ever change this, because otherwise communities are just mired in this poverty that causes all these other things.
Yeah, and it's been very tough conversation since Obama became the president. Because in the minds of many of our white friends, Obama is evidence that racism is no longer a factor in our society, in their mind. But we know differently, and so it's very tough to have that conversation about the impact and effects of racism preventing you from having opportunities. But we know that it is, particularly in this wealth area. You know, a lot of this wealth stuff is way back. I mean, I remember the Home Health Stead Act, where the United States was giving away land back in the slavery days, but out in the West, out here, giving away land. You get on a horse, and as far as you can ride, and when you stop, the land is yours. Well, African Americans weren't there. We weren't a part of that land grab. And so we didn't get that land. And later on, when they grabbed the land, here come the railroad, want to buy the land and buy it for hundreds of thousands, which would be millions now. And land that was given to them by the United States that handed down to family to family to family. African Americans weren't at the table to be a part of that wealth. There are inventions, products that the federal government has financed and researched and developed for the military, for military use, tax dollars. And for instance, the Humvee, the Hummer. Y'all, who knows the Hummer? That vehicle. That's a military vehicle. The military paid. It was whoever the GM or whoever it was paid by the military to design and build that vehicle for the military. I remember being a soldier riding that vehicle before it hit the American market. After so many years, the agreement is that that company would own the patent on it and push it to the market. And that's what they did. They pushed it to the market and sold it to you and I, but they didn't pay for the research, they didn't pay for the design, they didn't pay for, your tax dollars pay for all of that. And there's a lot of inventions that the United States government, military and otherwise, paid for, and the patents were given away to American citizens to push to the market and make a boatload of money on. African Americans didn't participate in any of that. And you can go on and on and on and on about these kind of things that contribute to what we see to be the wealth gap and distribution of wealth in our country, so and on and on and on and on. But it is a factor that we have to really come to terms with. Anyone else have any other questions?
I have a comment and a question. Thank you very much. I like the analysis. The multivariate approach to our problems is deep. As a consumer of literature, I would like to know, do you have a summary of what you have just said to us? If I were to go on the web, or if I were to request an email, so that I can take those arguments, which are my arguments also, so I can take those arguments and share them with others.
Well, that's an interesting question. I haven't really written this down, but that's a good idea. I will do that this week and put it on the Foundation's website and get that information to Reverend Francis, because I think this is a discussion that needs to be had, especially since it really negates the argument of blaming the community for these problems, because there's a lot of that goes on, especially in the white community, where people will say to me, well, you know, it's their fault because they're not doing this with their young people, they're not doing that, you know, these kids, you know, have no values. Well, why is that? When you're living in abject poverty, and that's what it's about. I mean, that statistic you just had, Reverend Francis, about the number of African Americans in poverty, that's astounding, because the white population is so much bigger. It didn't used to be that way. So things are continuing to get worse. And you can't hold people responsible when they're basically imprisoned in these terrible circumstances and have to make terrible choices every day just so they can feed their family.
Anyone else on this poverty issue? Bridgett also talked about the racial issue, the racial divide that we know is so evident. And one of the things I appreciate about Bridgett and Ted Wolford, who is here as well from N-Team, is another one of our organizations that does great work in the African American community. I appreciate seeing him here. But both Ted and Bridgett are two of our white friends that I know who are not afraid to have the race conversation, even with their white family and friends. They're not afraid to have it. And quite frankly, it's a conversation that we need more white people willing to have with their white families and friends from that perspective. Because once we start talking about race, folks shut down. We're pulling the race card. When we talk about race, we're pulling the race card and they shut down. So we really need our white friends who understand the privilege that they have, who understand the white gap, to really push that conversation with their family and friends that are out west and in the rural areas and in our suburban areas as well, who really just can't see and have made those connections that Bridgett has spoken so eloquently about. So I appreciate her for that, and Ted and others in our community who are working very hard to shed light on this conversation. All right. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Bridgett and I are really good friends, and I really appreciate what she has to say. You know, but one of the things that often appears to me is that we need to have some conversations about race and class and color in the black community. Because, you know, if you look at it historically, y'all know the story about Willie Lynch, right? And in the Willie Lynch story, you know, Massa systematically said, I got to turn them against each other. If I can turn them against each other, I don't have to worry about it because they don't take care of it themselves. So I think that, you know, one of the things that we as people of African descent, African Americans need to do is to have conversations among ourselves about who we are, our identity. So I really think that, you know, everything that Bridgett and Reverend Francis said is true. But we know that these issues are internal. I mean, you know, that you know, part of it is we don't like ourselves. If you don't like yourself, how you gonna like people who look like you? So we need to come to grips with whether Willie Lynch is real or wasn't real. We need to come to grips with that and have conversations about us. Because, you know, if we, and I told Bridgett, we were talking earlier, reparations without preparation ain't gonna work. Because within 25 years, the people with the money will have that same money back again.
Yes, sir.
And we will say, I have paid my fund, but the money gone. So we have to be prepared for change. And I always say that one of the things that happened in the 60s is that we got integration without preparation. Right. Integration without preparation. We didn't have a think tank that says, well, if they pass this law on voting rights, and if they pass this law on fair housing, how are we going to manipulate it in order to keep this money in this capitalistic society? In our communities, you know, we used to have a black business community. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said, I don't know the number, but how many banks are there in the United States of America? And they said 25 black banks in the United States of America. 25. And how many we got in St. Louis? Huh? Oh, we used to have Gateway National Bank? Come on, isn't it? So what I'm saying is that it has to be internal and external, you know, because we have to deal with making ourselves who we want to be. Because the issue of identity is a powerful issue in human development. Who am I? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ron Jackson. Okay, the time is near. It is just about 10, and what a great conversation we have had about the Ferguson effect on the social services sector. And I think Bridgett elevated that conversation to a level that we really needed to do, and that is the equity issue. And that's something that we have, that's an ongoing conversation that we have to continue to talk about how we close that equity gap and that wealth gap in our community and push legislation and policy and people where it needs to be pushed. Did you enjoy it? Let's give Bridgett another hand. We appreciate her compliment for sharing, for taking time out of her Sunday to come and be with us. And so we're so excited about that. On next Sunday,